Hello everyone, my name is Maggie Parry Hughes and I'm Academy Lead Admiral Nurse. Following on from the last session on frailty, I'm going to be talking about how people living with dementia are at high risk from increased frailty. I'm going to start with a short story about Henry. It's not based on a specific case, but the story does represent situations, unfortunately, we often see for people with a diagnosis of dementia. After my short presentation, I'll be joined by my colleague Gill, and we will be discussing the events that occurred. Please do feel free to add your thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat box. It might be that you can relate to some of the events described. So before I share Henry's story, here's a reminder that frailty is when older people are at risk of adverse outcomes, such as dramatic changes in their physical and mental well-being after apparently minor events, which challenges their health and in some circumstances can lead to a deterioration in their ability to live independently. I've added below some of the main areas that increase risks. So Henry is a 78-year-old man diagnosed with Alzheimer's 2 years ago. He lives on his own since his wife died several years previously of cancer. His daughter lives an hour away and visits regularly with her husband and grandson, and they have a close relationship. He's quite independent and manages well with some prompts to help with his memory. He was also treated for depression and anxiety after the death of his wife, and again after his initial diagnosis of dementia. He keeps active, he enjoys walking and still occasionally plays golf at the local club and has a supportive circle of friends that he meets regularly. Apart from moderate arthritic pain and enlarged prostate, he is mobile and reasonably healthy. So while out for a walk, Henry stumbled and fell on the way out of his shop. The shopkeeper called the ambulance and about 2 hours later admitted to A&E. It seems he didn't have a fracture, but a nasty cut on his leg, and unfortunately broke his spectacles. As it was busy, it was a few hours before he was actually seen and examined in A&E. He had been to X-ray and then moved to an assessment ward and then a medical ward for further treatment and investigations. His daughter was eventually contacted and arrived several hours later. But by the time she arrived, her father was agitated, confused, and very resistive to medical assessment and nursing intervention. And he was also prescribed benzodiazepine to reduce distress and agitation. So Henry ended up in hospital for 2 weeks, and during that time, his mobility reduced and his physical and mental health deteriorated and was discharged to a care home. The question is, what happened to Henry that caused his health to deteriorate so quickly? And perhaps you already have your thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation now and invite Gill to discuss Henry's case. Hello, Gill, and welcome.
Hi, Maggie.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm just wondering, Maggie, what happened to Henry? I mean, how sad, just devastating outcome for somebody who was so previously independent and after literally a stumble and a skin tear, ended up becoming increasingly frail and assessed as needing full-time care. It does demonstrate, doesn't it, how people who have dementia are clearly vulnerable. So what happened to him, Maggie? How did he get into that situation?
Yeah, I agree, Gill. Really tragic. And unfortunately, this isn't an isolated situation, as there are so many cases like Henry's. We're all aware that people with dementia have an increased risk of frailty, but sadly, sometimes hospital admissions, a lack of understanding, and a sequence of events can increase those risks. So when Henry fell outside the shop, he initially was reluctant to go to hospital. He had some fears and bad memories of when his wife died. However, the shopkeeper convinced him, and he had a painful leg, which, although was due to a cut, it was hard to tell whether he'd sustained a fracture. So when he waited a couple of hours before the ambulance came, and then a couple of hours before admission to A&E. And in that time alone, he had nothing to eat or drink, and no one with him to get him anything. I think at that point he was really quite anxious, but able to explain what happened and provide details. He didn't want his daughter contacting at that point because he assumed that he'd be going home soon after he'd been seen, and he didn't want to worry her.
Oh, okay. I mean, A&E can be busy and noisy, can't it? You know, and unfortunately, there's always a lot of waiting around. And of course, you know, he'd broken his glasses, so that wouldn't have helped at all. And then, of course, he went to X-ray and then back to the assessment ward, where I assume his leg would have been dressed. You know, it sounds reasonably straightforward. And once his leg was dressed, you know, he would have been discharged with antibiotics. You would have thought, anyway.
Yeah, no, I know you would really, wouldn't you? I mean, it could have been that straightforward, but this was now 5 hours later, and Henry was starting to develop a delirium, which we know can come on quickly. And given he had an infected wound, was probably becoming dehydrated, and hadn't got any analgesia offered for the pain, his arthritic pains, and a diagnosis of dementia, all made him really vulnerable. That and the fact that he was moved several times, his spectacles, of course, had broken, and then an environment was quite chaotic, added sort of further risks of a delirium and acute confusion.
Okay. So why was he given a benzodiazepine then, when we know that increases confusion for people with dementia?
Really good question, Jill. I mean, using antipsychotic medication or benzodiazepines in people with delirium has a potential to increase confusion. Henry became very suspicious and reluctant to have any interventions carried out, which is often the case when people have a delirium. He became very anxious and distressed, and when the doctor read Henry's medical notes and saw he had a diagnosis of dementia, assumed that that was the cause of his behaviour. They hadn't seen him when he initially arrived at A&E, when he was lucid and had capacity and was able to articulate, you know, his needs and what happened. So he was sedated. At that point, his daughter was contacted and arrived 2 hours later when Henry was moved to a ward. I mean, she was so shocked and very upset to see him that way.
I'm sure. You know, it makes me wonder, if Henry didn't have a diagnosis of dementia, would they have recognised it was a delirium earlier? Or perhaps would staff assume that because he was of a certain age, he'd had an undiagnosed dementia?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's interesting, isn't it? And it's possibility. I mean, his daughter did speak to the staff and explain that the behaviour they were describing was not his father. You know, it was not her father, and he was a gentle soul who was independent and managing well before his fall. Problem was they didn't really listen and put it down to advancement of dementia. I mean, as frustrated and upset as she was, she assumed they were the experts and knew what they were talking about.
You know, that must be so difficult for families, you know, when they know the person so well, but they don't feel like they're being listened to by the professionals. You know, we know it's not normal for someone with dementia to deteriorate so drastically within a few hours, you know, without some underlying cause anyway. So what happened then, Maggie?
Well, I think over the next week or so, he wasn't eating or drinking much, but his daughter was able to sort of visit and help and encourage him. And because he was sedated and his arthritic pain increased, his mobility reduced. I mean, as mentioned, you know, he had an enlarged prostate, which previously caused him some frequency and urgency, but not real issues. But due to his increased confusion, had episodes of incontinence. His overall health just deteriorated and became increasingly frail, hence the decision and need for full-time care.
So what do you think might have helped and prevented Henry's sudden deterioration like that?
I think, unfortunately, like most things, it does come down to understanding and communication and information being passed on from professional to professional. You know, when the ambulance picked Henry up, and when initially he was admitted to A&E, he was fully alert and able to answer questions and share details. Then he was moved several times to different teams, and that information not necessarily passed on So each time he was seen by a different team, he was deteriorating. Ideally, on admission, an abbreviated mental test, an AMT-10, or similar cognitive assessment could have been carried out. And that would have provided a sort of a cognitive baseline so that any deterioration could have then been identified. I mean, there are also several delirium assessment tools, including the CAMS, which help to identify if there's a sudden change in a person's behaviour and presentation, which can be helpful to determine if a delirium is present. I mean, we know that older people are more susceptible, and they are up to increased frailty, and how people with dementia are at higher risk from a delirium. So ensuring they receive the basic needs, fluid, food and pain relief are so important, particularly in the absence of family members. I mean, also providing reassurance and just explaining what's happening can be really helpful, because he was quite frightened.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds, doesn't it, like it would have been really helpful to have had an advocate or a specialist health professional who could identify and support potentially vulnerable adults, particularly those living with dementia, and just to ensure that they're seen quickly and treated and then discharged safely.
Absolutely, Jill. I mean, it's difficult to know how, the outcome would have been different, but so often people like Henry spend unnecessary lengthy times in hospital and discharge often delayed. I mean, your suggestion to have someone to support during admission would be great, wouldn't it? It may seem unrealistic, but would not only reduce the risks of people becoming frail, but also unnecessary distress for the person and their family, not to mention bed occupation and huge amounts of money. Yet no one knew Henry or were prepared to listen to the person who did.
Oh, okay, thanks, Maggie, and thank you to everyone who's listening. It certainly demonstrates, doesn't it, how people with dementia are at increased risk of frailty, and how us as professionals can reduce the risk for people living with dementia.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jill.